So I'm very glad to be here. I must say, I thought the organising committee was very courageous to invite an economist to make a plenary presentation and to participate in the panel. As you probably know, economists are, on the whole, very boring people. You probably have heard the definition of an economist, which is that an economist is somebody who doesn't have sufficient personal charisma to become an accountant. That's largely true. Economists also have very poor taste in clothes. They dress very badly, so that's why I'm wearing this very beautiful tie today to try to... You can always recognise the economists by their ties. Another one, the only other person in the audience who has a tie is an economist too, I think. So, we do make an effort every now and then to live up to the occasion. But if we're going to... I think the reason for having an economist to talk at this session, or to introduce this session, is that we do need to understand something about the economy and the way in which the economic context provides the environment within which we operate, whatever we're doing. And so my presentation is firstly to look at that context, and then to think about the various stakeholders who are implicated in this, artists, cultural managers and policymakers, and then to say something about the role of research and the ways in which this can be brought on board in this context. So turning first of all to the context, I think the context in which we're working is really determined by what has come to be known as globalisation. That has become in some ways a cliche, and also something that's not always very clear or easy to define, but I think it is clear that the motivation for globalisation, which has been going on, processes which have been going on for about 10 years or more, have to do with new technologies. Particularly new technologies of computation and so on, which have exploded in the last 10 years, and also the connectivity through the internet. Of course, people do point out that globalisation is not a new phenomenon, and globalisation has been going on in one way or another for 200 or 300 years. But the sort of globalisation we're talking about now has to do with particularly with these new communications and information technologies, and the environment in which these technologies have been put into effect has been determined by the neoliberal economic ideology, which has now really taken hold in most of the developed world and quite a lot of the developing world as well. And you all know the sort of terms of reference of the Neoliberal Project, which is free markets are the best way of allocating resources, other things being equal, and this has seen a gradual transfer over time, over the last decade or so, from public involvement to private involvement. In other words, a sort of transfer of power, if you like, from the public sector to the private sector. Not to say that the public sector has no power or that the private sector is necessarily dominant, but nevertheless there has been a very noticeable shift in that sort of a direction. And that has posed particular problems for, and also particular opportunities for the cultural sector. I think in relation to the opportunities, the sorts of things which we're familiar with is that the expansion of the internet has led to all sorts of opportunities for communications between cultural practitioners, for expansion of markets, particularly if the global marketplace really means anything, the capacity of cultural producers to be able to expand their markets because of the access to the internet, and also at a more sort of pure level, if you like, the development of new forms of artistic expression which are enabled by the new technologies. And so this is something which I think is very clear as being opportunities, and these opportunities will continue. On the other hand, of course, there are some threats, and the main threat which has been identified in the sort of international discussion about globalisation has been the threat to cultural expressions which comes to cultural production, which can't compete in the global marketplace for one reason or another. And this the sort of paradigm example of this is film and television, on the audiovisual industry, which is up against the might and the power of the Hollywood producers, and that means that national film production or television production is seriously threatened, and governments have to take any opportunity they can to protect or safeguard. The word protect is sometimes a difficult one for economists to get their head around, because we don't like protectionism. But on the other hand, I think the sort of thing that we talk about when we talk about safeguarding vulnerable cultural expressions is really more a question of saying we need to recognise the role and the value of certain cultural expressions, and that if that requires some form of fiscal intervention or regulatory intervention, well then that's done for a specific purpose and not just simply to protect inefficient industries and so on. So that's the sort of environment, and I think if we sort of project that forward for the next 20 years, we find really pretty much a continuation of the same sorts of trends, certainly in relation to technology. I don't think anybody can predict where that's going. I don't think anybody could really have predicted 10 years ago where we would be today in terms of the power, capacity and range of the sorts of things which the new technologies have enabled us to do. And I think that there doesn't seem to be any limit to well, there probably is a limit, but we haven't encountered it yet, to the continuing development of new ways of using technology and so on. So I think that that's something which we have to accept is going to continue. When I say have to accept, I think we should probably welcome it, but nevertheless it is something which will also continue to bring the sorts of threats that I have mentioned. But I don't think we can, as I said, I don't think we can predict that, and I'm not sure that anybody can. What's more interesting, perhaps, from our point of view, is what does the future hold for the neoliberal project, the other side of the coin, as it were. If we look at the global financial crisis of the last 2, 3, 4 years, we can see that the precepts of neoliberal economics have been subject to a fairly serious challenge, and I think that's something which in the profession of economics is gradually being taken on board, although probably not fast enough. In the practical world of the real world of markets, it probably isn't being taken into account at all, and there's a sense in which after being knocked over for a while, the financial markets have picked themselves up and are going back and doing pretty much what they did before, and whether or not they're subject to a bit more regulation to try and control them a little bit better is not even clear. So it's rather difficult to see just where the Neoliberal Pet Project goes from here. I think the interesting question is, if there is this continuing transfer of power from public to private means, does it mean that this could go on forever and that eventually the state or the collective interest might disappear? And I don't think that's the case, likely to be the case. And in fact, it raises the question, is there a sort of irreducible minimum size for the nation state, which means that it won't go any lower? And I think that the reason why there must be such a limit to the decline of the nation state, or the decline of I don't necessarily mean just nation states, but the state in general. I think that the reason why it will continue is because there is always a need for collective action, and the two things which the state does and that the private sector can't do is redistribution that is to protect the weaker members of society and so on. We know that capitalism is a very good creator of wealth, but a very poor distributor of wealth, and so we really need, and in fact the other side of the coin is that socialism is not a very good creator of wealth, but it's a good distributor. So we have to somehow or other to find the sort of social democratic balance somewhere in the middle, where we use the power of the market to generate wealth, but we distribute it a little bit more equitably than we have been doing. And the other thing which governments do, which generally speaking can't be done in any other way, is the provision of public goods. this is something which will continue. This is what Adam Smith said, that the role of the state is really to just produce public goods which can't be produced in other ways. In Adam Smith's day, back in the late 18th century, there was a slightly smaller range of public goods that could be produced, but nevertheless the principle was the same. But the other thing which the state does, of course, is it has a symbolic role, and it has a symbolic role in representing the sort of collective identity. And this again is something which the corporate sector can't really do. Individual corporations may have a symbolic role in representing their own corporate identity, and that might somehow or other filter down to the people who work there, so that people can be, you know, employees of IBM or something like that, and they sing the IBM song and so on. But I don't think that really is any substitute for the notion that we all share some sorts of collective identities, it's plural, and that is best represented in some sort of way. And so far the best way we've found to do that is through the collective means of government. So I think that what's fairly clear is that the state won't disappear, and the role for collective action in the public interest won't disappear. What's more likely to change is just the way in which that's implemented, and we may be looking to the emergence of more efficient states, and states which can do things better. There's a very, one of the arguments which has always been put forward for privatisation of public enterprises is that the private sector is more efficient than the public sector, and the public sector is inherently inefficient. There's nothing necessarily true about that, and it's quite possible that we could have an extremely efficient public sector if we organised it in a different way. And those are things which I think we'd be thinking about in the next 20 years. That's the context. Let me move on to the stakeholders. And first of all, the first, and in some ways, some people might say the most important stakeholders are artists. And the context within which artists are working, of course, has been changing significantly, and there have been some very interesting papers presented in the last couple of days which have been looking at these issues. They've taken advantage of new technologies to invent entire new art forms, and of course they also have new ways of communicating with each other and ways of communicating with their audiences. We've done a lot of surveys, so we've done a series of surveys in Australia of artists, and the one thing that one finds about artists is wherever they are in any part of the world, they do tend to have the same sorts of characteristics, and you can do research work on artists in Finland or Australia or America or Colombia or anywhere, and you tend to find the same sorts of results. We've been, the most recent one of these we did last year, or no, 2009, and we are finding, and I think this is true in other countries as well, that artists are becoming increasingly savvy about the business environment, that they're looking for new revenue streams. This is partly motivated by the traditional low incomes which artists earn and the multiple job holding which they have to indulge in, but it's also motivated to some extent in a positive way rather than a negative reaction to low incomes, because I think the idea, well, we use the term portfolio careers to describe the sort of careers that artists are developing for themselves, not as employees of some, say, symphony orchestra or ballet company or gallery or something for the rest of the whole of their lives, but rather that there's SMEs, small to medium enterprises, who operate as independent contractors, and so their work agenda is a series of folios in their portfolio, which they can choose as they go. And one of the things which we have found in the work that we've been doing in Australia is that we have usually thought that working outside of the arts is a sort of second best for artists. And one of the things which seems to be coming out now is that artists actually may choose to work outside the arts, to deploy their creative skills in other areas, because it gives them a challenge, because not only because it gives them another revenue source, but it gives them a creative challenge as well. And so we do find now, and this is, of course is being facilitated by the availability of technology or new technologies. And so this is something which is something of a change of mindset, if you like, that it's not just taking a job as a taxi driver or as a waiter or in a restaurant or something just to keep the body and soul together. It's looking for ways of applying the creative skills outside of the arts. And of course this is something which is a benefit to the, or could be a benefit to the economy as a whole, which I'll just mention in a moment. The other thing I suppose to say briefly about artists is that all of these developments have an implication for arts education and training. And I think this is very clear, it has been for quite some time. The importance, particularly, one thing, given the rise of the social media, the Facebooks and so on, and the fact that virtually anybody can become a creator, one of the things which is very important for professional artists is indeed their professionalism. And the notion of safeguarding some sense of the standards of the profession, whether it's acting, whether it's visual art, whether it's literature, whatever it is, the idea that there is some sort of standard which has to be maintained and which isn't necessarily just available to anybody. It's not to be, that's not to be disparaging about people who play music in their garage or put their latest musical effort up on Facebook or something like that. It may be terrible, but at least they're doing something. That I think that the question from the point of view of the professional artist is to maintain the notion of those professional standards. And part of that process is also the need to acquire new business skills, and that's something which has been around in arts education now for quite some time. Moving on to cultural managers, I would begin this by saying that, and this is something which is pretty clear to everybody here, and so I hesitate to just simply say things which all of you know already, but it doesn't hurt to stress again that there is a narrowing gap between for-profit management and non-profit management in the cultural sector and the arts sector. In the old days, as you would know, this has always been seen as something fairly separate, that the non-profit sector had its own problems and that the commercial sector had its own problems, and that these weren't really terribly close to each other. Nowadays, I think we're seeing, particularly with the rise of the application of new technologies in arts organisations and cultural organisations right across the board, I think we're seeing the emergence of the need to develop new business models. And that means that they're essentially addressing, these business models are essentially addressing the same sorts of problems. And so it's, I'm not, as I say, I'm not saying anything particularly original by saying that new technologies are driving the changes in the business model, and this is all driven by convergence, by the rise in social media, by changing consumption patterns, and so on. I was involved last year in a research project in the UK, looking at the application of new technologies in cultural institutions. We took two of the major cultural institutions, in this case it was the Tate Gallery and the National Theatre, and we used those as examples. Admittedly, they're right at the top of the tree, as it were, but nevertheless they were good examples of the ways in which new technologies are being used by cultural institutions. In the case of the gallery, and this is true for museums and galleries everywhere, the use of, not just the use of the website and so on, but the development of new ways of presenting the collection to both people who are visiting the gallery, but also to people online. And we looked at an online survey. We did an online survey of people who accessed a particular exhibition that the Tate put on online, and we compared their reactions to the people who were actually in the gallery itself and saw the real thing. And we did the same sort of thing with the National Theatre, which is applying the new technology of capture of live performances and transmission by satellite to cinemas. And that's a very major development which is happening in the performing arts. It's already been going for some years with the Metropolitan Opera, as I'm sure you would know, and other organisations are picking up on it as well. And this so-called NT Live, National Theatre Live project, is doing this too, and it's been very successful. The National Theatre has been very clear, in the first instance at least, that this is not like just a way of recording a performance and then playing it back at some future date, but a way of engaging people in the live experience of actually going to see the performance. And so the satellite transmission happens as it's happening in the theatre, and people are watching it in cinemas all around, not just around the UK but also in Europe, exactly as it happens. It's like watching a live football match. It's happening as you watch, and so it's being sold and marketed as just an alternative way of going to the theatre. And it has very big implications for the audience reach of the theatre, and also potentially at least for their revenue generation in the future. So these are all things which are down the track and which are confronting cultural managers in a big way. I think though at the end of the story in relation to the cultural managers and cultural organisations, we can see, again, it's a rather sort of obvious conclusion that sustainability, financial sustainability, and sustainability of the cultural mission are things which are important, in fact vital. And one of the things which I would stress is that the second of those things, the cultural mission, is in some senses, if you have to be clear, I had to sort of choose which one was important, I think it would be pretty clear that you'd say that the cultural mission is the reason why these organisations exist. The cultural organisations and arts organisations exist to create art, to show art, to distribute art, and that's their reason for being there. It's not like a sort of profit-making company which has to please the shareholders. This is something which is to do with the creation of art and the advancement of culture. And so when there's a sort of conflict, and I was on the board of a Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney a few years ago, and the museum was having problems, financial problems, and they brought on some businessmen onto the board, and the businessmen wanted to say all the time, we've just got to have big blockbuster shows, we've got to get the revenue in, we've got to have the big blockbuster shows. And they did that for a little while, and it got some revenue in, but the artistic mission and the artistic purpose became sort of lost. And it wasn't until that purpose of presenting contemporary art, sort of cutting-edge contemporary art, which was the real purpose of why this place existed, it wasn't until that was recaptured that the whole thing took off again, and now I'm glad to say it's doing very well. So it's a sort of object lesson in how you mustn't let the businessmen get too close to the action in some of these situations. But I would characterise this ultimately as finding a balance between, and you won't be surprised to hear me say I'm always talking about economic value and cultural value, and this is just another example of the same thing. Now, let me move finally to the question of policy. And here I think the big issue for cultural policymakers is the question of the creative economy. How do we deal with the creative economy, so-called? The creative economy being that sort of subsector of the macroeconomy where we have creative products produced, and it's being looked to in a number of countries as a source of economic dynamism, of investment, of employment growth, and so on, all of which is by and large true in varying degrees in different countries and in different circumstances. There has been in some cases a sort of a tendency to talk it up a little bit more than it perhaps deserves, but nevertheless the basic proposition that creativity is in some sense the new resource, which is part of the information economy, that it leads to, creativity leads to innovation, innovation leads to technological change leads to growth, it generates employment and so on. These sorts of connections are all true enough, and if a government can be smart enough about formulating its cultural policy, it can take advantage of these sorts of things. And indeed, if we look around Europe, we can see this happening very clearly, and most of the many of the European governments are quite actively, and the EU itself are looking quite actively at how to comprehend the nature of the creative or the cultural economy, and how to provide policies, for example, ways of providing investment incentives and so on, to encourage the growth of this sector. A lot of this comes down to questions of from the point of view of the arts and cultural industries, it comes down to a question of where do the cultural industries fit within this broader picture of the creative economy, or indeed within the picture of the economy as a whole. And this is something which has caused some discussion both within the economics profession, the cultural policy people as well, as to how to comprehend the nature of the cultural economy and the cultural industries in such a way that it makes some sense of where the creative arts fit. Because the arts tend to be, in this sort of whiz-bang, economically dynamic environment, the arts, the poor old artist in the studio or the arts organisation trying to produce plays or music or whatever tends to get sort of put a little bit to the periphery because they don't seem to have a role to play in this sort of dynamic environment. And I think it all depends on the way in which we characterise and conceptualise the cultural industries. And I'm sure many of you would have seen the stuff that I've been doing, not the only one, others have been sort of developing this same argument as well, of the notion of the cultural industries as a series of concentric circles in which the creative arts are right in the centre. And so there's two ways in which they interact with the rest of the cultural economy, which includes, as you can see there, film, museums, literature, music, performing arts and visual arts in the centre, film, museums, heritage services, publishing, the media, advertising, architecture and so on. And these are all getting further and further out. And what happens is, first of all, that the sort of creative ideas that are generated in the core by these are pure creative ideas in sound, in text, in image, in still image, in moving image, by artists in the centre. These move outwards and diffuse in some sort of way by knowledge transfers and so on to other industries and animate the innovation process in other areas. But also we have direct skills transfers because people who are trained as artists in the centre will move and work and carry their skills with them to work in these other industries. And so this notion that there's this sort of movement from the centre is something which I think has a lot of traction in trying to re-emphasise the importance of the creative arts in this broader economic picture. And it's not to say, of course, that the only reason why the creative arts exist is to be part of the creative economy, but that's not it at all. It's to put this into its proper perspective. And what it means in terms of policy is that if you want to have a flourishing cultural sector, creative sector, and by implication the rest of the economy, then you need to ensure that that central core is properly looked after. And so if we're going to have some sort of, over the next 20 years, some rethinking of cultural policy, I've just suggested 4 points there that would be characteristic of effective cultural policy. It would comprehend the economic benefits, but recognise the fundamental importance of cultural value as a component of the public value which is created by the cultural sector. It would foster a positive climate for private sector engagement with the arts. This is in a way saying, okay, this sort of process of growth of the private sector is going to continue, and rather than see it as a threat, it could be harnessed in terms of public-private partnerships and other means of public and private cooperation. And then finally, to promote cultural policy as a core function right across the board. This is the whole of government approach, because it's not just culture, and it's not just the Minister of Culture who's responsible for a cultural policy. It extends right across the board. So, further reading, yes, if you this is a piece of shameless self-promotion is due. I can't go on talking about cultural policy any longer, but you could read that book and it might fill in some of the gaps. Finally, the role of researchers. This is something which I think, as I said at the beginning, AMAC has a particular role to play here, and the journals IJAM and JAMLS do this in an exemplary fashion, providing the means for connection between the academics and the people who are doing the research and the practicing world. And this is a two-way interaction. It's not as if the academics just dream up the answers and hand them down like from the top of Mount Olympus. It's much more a two-way process where there's an interaction between, there's a desirable interaction between the two. And so I think that's the notion of researchers, whether they're working in the academic world, whether they're working in NGOs, because a lot of research gets done there, in private consulting, even there's some research goes on, and also in government. These sorts of, these areas of research do connect with the practical world of cultural management, arts and cultural management. And I think one of the things which one would say is that we really do need to have multiple voices in this situation. And I say that as an economist. Economists have been guilty of thinking that theirs is the only voice that's really worth listening to. And so quite a lot of economists probably still think the same thing. But it's not the case, obviously. And in fact, I must say from my own perspective, the work that I've done has benefited more than I can say from interaction with other social scientists, people working in the arts, in art theory, and so on and so on and so on. And also with practical people. And so it's really a question of bringing all of these multiple voices to the table. Thank you very much.